On October 14, 2011, the board of Olympus Corporation held a meeting at its Tokyo headquarters that lasted less than an hour. When it ended, the company's chief executive had been removed from his position by unanimous vote. The man removed was Michael Woodford. He had been chief executive for 14 days. He was not dismissed for performance. He was not dismissed for conduct. He was dismissed because he had asked, in writing, for an explanation of $1.7 billion in corporate payments that he could not reconcile with any legitimate business purpose, and because the people he asked had no answer they were willing to give. The payments had been made between 2006 and 2008, recorded as advisory fees and acquisition write-downs. The fees were among the largest ever paid in Japanese corporate history for transactions of their scale. The acquisitions were of companies with negligible revenues and no strategic logic. One made microwavable containers. Another sold cosmetics by mail order. Olympus had paid nearly $700 million to acquire and then write down businesses worth a fraction of that sum. Woodford had spent weeks attempting to understand the transactions through internal channels. He had commissioned an independent review. He had written to the chairman. He had received nothing that satisfied him. So he had done what, in his experience of British corporate governance, a chief executive was obliged to do. He had put his concerns formally on the record and waited for the board to respond. The board responded by removing him from office. What Woodford had not yet fully understood, as he boarded a flight back to London that evening with a collection of internal documents in his briefcase, was that the payments he had questioned were not an anomaly. They were the final transaction in a concealment that had been running systematically and deliberately for over 20 years. A structure built to absorb and hide losses that Olympus had accumulated during Japan's asset price bubble and had never found the courage to declare. The scandal that followed his dismissal would expose not just one company's fraud, but the precise institutional conditions that had allowed it to remain hidden. A governance architecture in which auditors, boards, and regulators each operated within incentive structures that made looking the other way the rational choice, and in which the one person who looked directly was the one person who could be removed. To understand why Olympus concealed losses, it is necessary to understand how those losses were generated, and what the Japanese corporate environment of the late 1980s looked like from the inside. Olympus was founded in 1919 as a manufacturer of microscopes and optical instruments. By the post-war decades, it had expanded into cameras, endoscopes, and industrial equipment. Its medical division, particularly its endoscopy products, was genuinely world-class, holding significant global market share in a high-margin, technology-intensive sector. The core business was sound. In the late 1980s, as Japan's asset price bubble inflated equity and real estate values to historic levels, many Japanese corporations moved aggressively into financial investment. The practice, known as Zytec, roughly translated as financial engineering, involved deploying corporate cash reserves into stocks, real estate, and investment products to generate returns that exceeded those available from the core business. It was widespread, normalized, and for a period, profitable. Olympus was not exceptional in participating. It invested heavily in financial products through the late 1980s, generating paper returns that supplemented operating income. When the bubble collapsed, beginning in 1990 and accelerating through the early 1990s, those paper returns became real losses. Japanese equity markets fell by roughly 60% from their peak. Property values collapsed. The investment portfolios assembled during the boom became liabilities. For Olympus, the losses were severe. Internal estimates, reconstructed later, suggested the company had accumulated investment losses of approximately 100 billion yen. At the time, roughly $1 billion by the early 1990s. Recognizing those losses in the accounts would have been damaging to the company's reputation, its credit rating, and the standing of executives who had authorized the investments. The decision was made not to recognize them. The mechanism used to hide Olympus's losses was not improvised. It was a deliberate, architecturally sophisticated system that evolved over 2 decades as Japanese accounting standards changed and the original instruments required replacement. The initial approach exploited a feature of Japanese accounting rules in the 1990s that allowed financial securities to be held at purchase price rather than market value. By transferring the loss-making investments to affiliated funds and special-purpose vehicles, entities connected to Olympus but not consolidated in its accounts, the losses could be removed from the main balance sheet entirely. This arrangement held until the early 2000s, when Japan introduced mark-to-market accounting requirements. The concealment structure that had worked for a decade was now at risk of exposure. The response was more elaborate. A small group of senior executives, later identified as including Chairman Tsuyoshi Tikukawa, Vice President Hisashi Mori, and Executive Auditor Hideo Yamada, worked with external financial advisors to engineer transactions that would absorb the losses into the accounts without naming them as such. The method: Olympus would acquire companies at dramatically inflated prices, then write down the excess payment rapidly as goodwill impairment. The write-downs produced accounting losses, but losses that appeared to reflect ordinary acquisition disappointment rather than concealed investment history. Simultaneously, Olympus paid extraordinary advisory fees on these transactions, routed through intermediary companies, some based offshore, that were recorded as legitimate business expenditure. The acquisitions included a manufacturer of microwavable containers, a mail-order cosmetics company, and a waste recycling business. None had revenues or prospects that justified the prices paid. The valuations were not miscalculation, they were design. By the time the scheme was complete, approximately $1.7 billion had cycled through Olympus's accounts. The books balanced. The auditors signed off. The board approved. The Olympus concealment was not invisible. It was noticed, repeatedly, over several years, and each time the notice produced insufficient action. In 2008, a Japanese financial magazine, Facta, published an investigative article raising questions about the valuations of Olympus's acquisitions and the size of its advisory fees. The article was specific enough to identify the transactions that would later prove central to the scandal. Olympus responded by threatening legal action. The story did not gain mainstream traction. The company's own auditors, KPMG AZSA, which replaced Ernst & Young Shin Nihon as Olympus's primary auditor in 2009, raised concerns internally about the acquisition valuations and the fee structures. Those concerns were communicated to management. The explanations provided were accepted. Unqualified audit options were issued. The structure of the concealment had been designed, in part, with audit scrutiny in mind. The use of offshore intermediaries limited the information available to any single auditing team. The transactions were spread across multiple financial years, reducing the concentration of unusual activity in any single reporting period. The advisors who structured the scheme had professional expertise in financial products and were, by several accounts, more technically sophisticated than the auditors reviewing their work. None of this absolves the auditors of responsibility, but it explains why the concealment persisted through multiple audit cycles at a company that was, in all other respects, a functioning and profitable business. The governance structure of Olympus reinforced the problem. Japanese corporate boards of the period operated under a model in which the distinction between executive management and independent oversight was considerably less pronounced than in Anglo-American corporate frameworks. Board members were overwhelmingly internal promotees. The company's statutory auditors, a separate oversight body required under Japanese corporate law, were drawn from within the executive structure. The independence that external scrutiny requires was structurally limited. When Woodford arrived as the first foreign chief executive in Olympus's history, he brought with him governance instincts formed in British corporate culture. He read the Factor articles. He commissioned an independent review by PricewaterhouseCoopers. He received a report describing the transactions as highly irregular. He wrote to the chairman. He was fired within a fortnight. Woodford's dismissal, rather than containing the scandal, detonated it. His decision, made on the advice of British lawyers in the days after his removal to go public with the documents he held, transformed a contained internal dispute into an international story. He gave interviews. He provided documents to regulators. He filed a report with the Serious Fraud Office in London. He appeared before cameras in a way that Japanese corporate whistleblowers, constrained by cultural norms around group loyalty and institutional deference, rarely do. The Tokyo Stock Exchange suspended Olympus shares. The company's market capitalization fell by more than 75% in the weeks following his dismissal. Credit rating agencies downgraded the company's debt. Banks that had extended credit lines began reviewing their exposure. The initial response at Olympus was containment. The company issued statements describing the payments as legitimate. The chairman gave a press conference at which he declined to answer substantive questions. The posture was one of institutional resistance. It collapsed within weeks. In November 2011, facing regulatory investigation and criminal referrals, Olympus established an independent investigation committee. Its report, delivered in December 2011, was explicit and comprehensive. The scheme to hide losses from the bubble era had been running since the early 1990s. It had involved the deliberate falsification of corporate accounts. It had been known to a small group of senior executives and concealed from the board, the auditors, and the shareholders for 2 decades. Kikukawa resigned. Mori resigned. Criminal charges followed. In 2012, the Tokyo District Court convicted Kikukawa, Mori, and Yamada of violating Japan's Financial Instruments and Exchange Act. The sentences, suspended prison terms, reflected the Japanese judicial system's general reluctance to impose custodial sentences in white-collar crime cases, absent evidence of personal financial enrichment. The executives had not, the court accepted, profited personally from the scheme. They had acted, in their own framing, to protect the company from the consequences of its own history. Olympus itself was fined 700 million yen, approximately $9 million, a figure widely criticized as disproportionately small relative to the scale of the fraud and the losses suffered by shareholders. The company survived, largely because its core endoscopy business retained sufficient commercial value that strategic acquirers remained interested. Sony took a significant minority stake in early 2012, providing both capital and a degree of reputational rehabilitation. Olympus continued to operate, restructured and substantially diminished in market value, but functionally intact. Woodford received a settlement from Olympus in 2012 for wrongful dismissal. He published detailed accounts of events and testified before regulatory bodies in both Japan and the United Kingdom. The investors who lost money through the share price collapse had limited formal recourse. A class action mechanism of the kind available in American securities litigation does not exist in the same form under Japanese law. Many losses were simply absorbed. The Olympus scandal is frequently narrated as a story about Japan, about its corporate culture, its institutional deference, its resistance to external oversight. That framing contains truth, but it is also too convenient. It allows the structural lessons to be quarantined as culturally specific when the mechanisms involved are considerably more universal. The concealment persisted for 20 years because every institution that should have detected it was operating with incentives that made non-detection the path of least resistance. Auditors who raise concerns about client transactions risk losing the audit relationship. The financial incentive runs toward accommodation rather than challenge, particularly when management explanations are plausible and transactions are technically complex. The Olympus auditors were not uniquely negligent. They were operating within an incentive structure that exists in every major audit market. Board members were former executives of the company whose careers had been made within its institutional culture. Independent challenge was not the function they had been selected to perform. The governance architecture produced a board whose primary orientation was toward the company's interests as defined by its management, which is precisely the architecture that concealment requires to survive. The regulatory framework responded to reported numbers rather than the process that produced them. A concealment designed to produce clean-looking data will not produce the anomalies that trigger scrutiny. The result was a 20-year gap between the existence of a material problem and its exposure. By definition, cannot be relied upon.